Welcome back. This is at least the beginning of the Chapter 10 lecture on woodwind instruments. So we're just now getting into our different classes of instruments. We start with woodwinds. Chapter 11 is brass instruments. 12 is strings, and specifically mostly on violins, but there's a little bit referencing guitar. Pianos get their whole own chapter in chapter 13. And if we have time, percussion instruments finish out the class. That will be dealing with drums and things like chimes and bells as well. But chapter 10, our first chapter for instruments, is dealing with woodwinds. This is the family of instruments that includes flutes and recorders. It also includes your reeded instruments, your single reeds like clarinets and saxophones, and then your double reeds like oboes and bassoons, and also pipe organs fall into the woodwind category as well. Pipe organs can be either just straight tubes or they can have reeds in them as well. Just what will change is what is providing the input that will essentially cause resonance, which that's where we're basically going to start after we just kind of refresh our memory on the differences between closed and open pipes, and then we'll get into a little bit more detail on some of the things later on. On the chapter 10 video page, there aren't that many videos this time. I have a couple videos that demonstrate the differences a little bit between a edge tone instrument, which are your flutes and recorders. So there's a video where there's a guy basically playing harmonics on a flute, and he shows a bad way to do it, but a way that works is just to blow harder. And this is called overblowing. And what this does is it shifts the noise spectrum to a higher frequency so that you can get the higher harmonics demonstrated or preferentially resonated by your instrument. When you do that, it just doesn't give you that much control, but it's there to demonstrate that. Then there's a video of a flute, or not a flute, a reed actually oscillating so you can see what the behavior is. It's a single reed, so it would be something more akin to what you see in a saxophone or a clarinet, but double reeds are not that different tonally or in the way they actually create sound that will then be resonated by your tube. The main difference when we start talking about clarinet versus all these other reed instruments is the clarinet is the only commonly played cylindrical bore woodwind with a reed. All the other woodwinds are conical. Now the cone may not be really extreme and noticeable, but it's there, and it changes the timbre of the instrument quite a bit. There's a fair amount of discussion on finger holes, of which I'm not an expert, so you probably won't get much past the slides. I will also have several links to the New South Wales acoustics pages where they actually discuss the influence of open versus closed pipes, so talking about clarinet versus flute in general, cylindrical versus conical bore, and all that stuff in a little bit more detail if you're interested in that. So when we deal with woodwind tone quality, there are three main influences on the tone. The first one, the source of the driving noise or vibration. This is basically, is it an edge tone or is it a reed instrument? Those have kind of their own characteristic sound to them. A edge tone is a little bit more flexible. You have a lot more of a noise spectrum. The vibration that comes from reeds functionally helps, but the reeds themselves will have their own kind of their own resonance based on how stiff they are and how you fix them to the mouthpiece or how you fix them to one another, in the case of a double reed. So there's that little extra factor in a reed instrument that is not there in an edge tone instrument. The size and shape of the bore. Shape is going to be important because it's going to change the harmonic content or the timbre of the instrument significantly. Size is just going to have to do with the loudness. The bigger the instrument is in terms of how wide your bore is. A wider bore moves more air. More air means a louder instrument, which is why a saxophone is significantly louder than a clarinet because it's a bigger bore instrument. And then the sizes and the positions of the finger holes. Sizing is going to factor in because it can change. It can change the positions of the different antinodes that you have set up in the instrument, depending on how you actually put those finger holes in. And a bigger finger hole, when you open it, tends to fix that antinode really strongly, while a smaller finger hole may not. Positions clearly are going to matter because that's going to determine essentially the pitch you play. There are some influences from body material and the inside finish of the bore, but these are not typically something that is incredibly important. Some instruments, flautists in particular, may swear by like a silver flute, but honestly, there's not all that much influence from having a silver flute versus one that might be mostly copper or something along those lines. The body material is usually not the influence. It's the fact that if you're going to spend all this money to make a flute out of silver, you're going to actually pay more attention to detail. And so it tends to be just a better constructed instrument in general than something that is going to be massively mass produced. But one of the things that I've always said with this is, if you think it makes you a better player, it's going to make you a better player a lot of the time, even if physically it doesn't have a lot of impact. But if you're more comfortable with that instrument, then you're going to play better. So it psychologically, it matters quite a bit as well. So just to go back, if we talk about cylindrical tubes, when we have an open tube like we do down here, we've got open on both ends. If we're looking at the displacement node for an open at both end tube, we have a displacement antinode so that the particles are free to move in and out at the ends. Same thing here. And this is our first harmonic. Our second harmonic, we insert a full standing wave segment in between those two. So we've got our antinodes here, and then an antinode in the middle, and then our third harmonic. Wavelength here would be equal to 2L. This would be equal to L. This would be equal to 2L over 3. And here they're showing the pressure nodes. Frequency, if your fundamental is F1, the second harmonic is 2F1, the third harmonic is 3F1. And so this is pretty common. This is essentially what we have for a flute. Also recorders. Now, if we have a closed pipe, so we've got a closed pipe at this end, an open pipe at this end, we still have a displacement antinode at the open end. And at the closed end, we have a displacement node because those particles are not free to move side to side anymore. And so what we end up with is, instead of the fundamental wavelength being 2L, it's going to be L over 4, or sorry, 4L, not L over 4, which means that the frequency of this closed pipe, if it's the same length as the open pipe we just looked at, is twice that, or sorry, 1/2 that of the open pipe. Since the wavelength is twice as long, the frequency has to be half of what the open pipe frequency is. So same length pipe will be about an octave down from an open pipe, which, if you compare a flute and a clarinet, it's pretty close to a octave off. The clarinet's almost an octave down. They're roughly the same length. And so that is the reason for that. Closed pipes are more like clarinet because the reed end will actually close off the airflow, and so that's what gives us the effectively closed end. In a flute or a recorder, you blow in one end and it's an open hole, and of course the other side is an open hole as well, so it behaves like an open pipe. When we go up a allowed mode in oscillation for a closed pipe, if you remember, we have to add our standing wave segment in, but we still have to have a displacement node at this end and a displacement antinode at this end. And what this means is, here my wavelength is 4L. Here my wavelength is 4L over 3. And here it's 4L over 5. And what this means is our frequency goes from whatever F1 is for this pipe, this closed pipe, to 3 times F1, and we skip those even harmonics. And we'll see in particular in a clarinet, this is actually really obvious. The clarinet's first 3 strong harmonics are 1, 3, and 5. And then after you get past that, the evens start to come in, and that has to do with the fact that it's not ultimately 100% straight cylinder. We've got the bell end at the end of the instrument, which changes the dynamics a little bit. Saxophones, which are also reed instruments, don't do this because of the shape of the bore, which is something we will get into in a lot more detail as we move on. So the first characteristic we said was the driving resonance. So how are we creating the oscillations that are going to resonate within the tube? And we have two major classes. We have the edge tone instruments and the reed instruments. And then within reed instruments, we split it into single and double reed. So an edge tone is a resonance caused by air flowing over a static edge. And it sounds really complicated, but essentially, if you're talking about a flute, you blow over the edge of the mouth hole to give you a little bit of kind of a white noise sound. And then, depending on how you have the flute fingered, a particular note will get picked out of the white noise spectrum and resonated, and that's the note you play. In a recorder, they actually have a fixed knife edge that you blow into the mouthpiece, and it directs it toward that knife edge, and that's where the edge tone comes from in a recorder. And organs are often a similar mechanism to that of the recorder. The flute is a little bit different, and it's a lot more flexible for a player because you have a lot more control over that edge tone, because you can reshape your mouth, reposition things so that you can have a lot more control over the dynamic range of the flute. Recorders and organs are a lot less flexible because you pretty much have this pretty determined speed of air flowing over your edge. Now, single reeds, the airflow causes the flexible reed to vibrate and flap against a fixed opening, so the mouthpiece of your clarinet or a saxophone. As you blow over the reed, it will vibrate up and down, sometimes allowing air into the saxophone or clarinet, and sometimes blocking it off completely. And this is what actually gives you the input so that you actually have sound created in those instruments. There are some organs that are also reeded, and we're not talking about a true reed organ which has metal reeds, and we're talking about still a pipe organ, but where instead of the air flowing past a knife edge like for an edge tone, it actually vibrates a reed, and then the reed's vibration is what causes the feedback in the pipe. This is a lot more flexible because you can tune the reed a lot more easily than you can tune just a regular old pipe with a knife edge at the bottom, without causing like a permanent piece to be cut out of it, which we'll talk about a little bit when we get into organs in a second, or talking about tunable reeds and stuff and how you can tune pipes. And then the double reeds are acoustically similar to the single reeds, except instead of a single reed flapping against a fixed opening, you have two reeds that will flap against one another. Now, this doesn't significantly change the vibration input, but there are differences in the way they sound, and I can't really quantify it, not being a wind player, especially not a double reed player. Double reed instruments are oboe, English horn, and bassoon. And oboe and bassoon are probably the more commonly known ones. An English horn doesn't look that different from an oboe. I think it's just in between the size of these two, if I remember correctly. All of these instruments are conical bore, and so they are going to behave more similarly to an open pipe than a closed pipe. Saxophone is a conical bore. Organ pipes that have reeds, I think, are still cylindrical bore, so they're more clarinet sounding. So when we talk about edge tones, we have to talk about fluid jets, because ultimately what we have is a jet of fluid air is being blown over the knife edge. Now, if we have a nice, well-defined jet of fluid that stays together, we have there what's called a laminar flow. And laminar flows are great if you're dealing with things like plumbing, or just moving fluids effectively in general, because you're able to define what's going on fairly easily. The downside for music is that a laminar flow like this is not going to produce noise, so it's not really useful to us. For a woodwind instrument, we need that noise spectrum to be able to pick out the frequencies that are resonant with your instrument. And so if you have a laminar flow, you don't have any noise to pick from, and your instrument doesn't do anything. You may remember that as a kid trying to blow in a recorder and you don't get anything. That might have been why, because you didn't get the turbulence in the airstream that you were looking for. At the bottom here, we have a turbulent flow. You have a lot of kind of rotational component to the motion instead of just straight linear motion. And the good thing about turbulent flow for us is that it is going to produce noise, and it's going to approximate a white noise spectrum. There's a big range of pitches that are available with no definite pitch, so you're not going to hear one particular tone. It's just going to sound like noise. Now, we will see that you can shift the pitch of the noise spectrum by blowing harder. So this doesn't really change the pitch, it just changes the available pitches. So in an edge tone, we'll start with a recorder because it's easier to describe. We blow in, that's the air source. This could also define a organ pipe that uses a knife edge. So you blow in, we hit this knife edge, and what the knife edge is going to do is going to split that nice laminar airflow and cause turbulence. And this turbulence is going to create a bunch of available frequencies that can match the resonances of the tube that it's attached to. So they mentioned a Fipple flute here. I think that is this piece combined with this piece would be a Fipple flute. So what happens is you get this turbulence here. If you have a frequency that matches the resonance of this pipe, then it's going to create a standing wave within the pipe where air can move in and out here, and create your audible tone at that point. If you don't have turbulence here to begin with, then you're not going to be able to create the standing wave. You have to have that available frequency to create that first motion down the pipe that then, when it gets to the open end down here, reflects back and comes in and then creates that standing wave. After 2 or 3 cycles, it sets up as a pretty consistent standing wave. So the feedback mechanism, you create turbulence from the edge tone. So you stimulate, it says all frequencies, but really it's a range of frequencies that has to do with kind of how quickly you're blowing the air over the knife edge and all that. Pressure waves from the far end of the tube reflect back and interfere with the edge tone turbulence and pick out those frequencies that match with the resonance of the tube. The time for the pressure wave to reflect off the end and come back is equal to 2 times the length over the speed of sound. And that reflected wave will reinforce the frequencies in the edge tone with frequencies that are equal to N times the S speed of sound. So resonance, N is the harmonic number, S is the speed of sound divided by 2L. So it's basically the harmonic series of the open tube that we saw back when we talked about resonance as an open tube. And this mechanism where the reflected pressure wave comes back and reinforces the edge tone is called feedback. And this is beneficial feedback. You might all be familiar with bad feedback where someone in an audience someone is talking and the sound system feeds back and you get that big squeal. That's not good feedback, but it's the same type of thing. You have something that is causing the signal to spike, and in that case, overwhelm the electrical speakers and all that. In this case, that won't really ever overwhelm it. It'll just increase the intensity of the sound so that you play those particular notes. Now, organ pipes are connected to an air source that blows in from the bottom. And there is this piece here on, I believe these are showing metal pipes and these are showing more wood type pipes. So the air gets directed this way towards the knife edge, and then it blows over the knife edge and creates that edge tone, and then we get the resonance from the long pipe that comes afterward. This is the same type of mechanism. Air comes in, gets directed toward not quite as sharp a knife edge, but still creates the turbulence here where the airflow hits this and gets split. And then we get our resonance with the pipe. Now, reed instruments behave a little bit differently. This is showing something that is more like a single reed. So the first thing what happens is we get a flow of air through the reed opening, drops the pressure. So when you put pressure on, you can force that reed, which is normally in a closed position. If you ever look at a mouthpiece on a clarinet, the reed rests on the mouthpiece under normal conditions. Atmospheric pressure keeps it closed. But when you blow on the mouthpiece, this can force this open, and that momentary time where it's forced open by that pressure will allow air to come in to this gap here. So you apply pressure, it opens the reed, and this is going to allow air in. And then once the air moves in past the reed opening, it moves quickly. And if you remember, fast moving fluids will cause a lower pressure. So that air moving in quickly creates a lower pressure on this side of the reed while you have a higher pressure on this side of the reed, which will then allow it to snap back. But if you're still applying that extra pressure, it's going to open back up and then close again, open back up and close. And so this overpressure is going to actually, they say overpressure. That's the difference between the outside and the inside where the air has moved in. That's going to close it back. But then that overpressure will allow it to open back up to begin with and then close back in completely. So it will also have some momentum when it hits the mouthpiece and then bounce back. So you get this rebounding motion, which once you start it oscillating, even though the Bernoulli effect is not what's going to allow it to force itself back, the combination of it bouncing back off of the mouthpiece, or in the case of a double reed instrument, bouncing off of the other reed, will open that passageway for the air up again, which will give you your input. It's a little bit more focused than what you get with an edge tone. An edge tone is not a perfect white noise spectrum, but it definitely is a lot more spread out in terms of available frequencies. Whereas a reed typically is going to have a well kind of defined resonant region, which is determined by how flexible and massive the reed is. Not unlike a mass on a spring has one particular frequency that it likes to oscillate at. When you set up a single reed in particular, you have it fixed, the flexibility of this reed will determine kind of its range where it creates vibrations. So they do provide a fairly broad range of frequencies, not quite as broad as an edge tone, but still broad. The stiffness of the mass, stiffness and mass of the reed are going to determine the range of resonance. So if you have a very stiff, massive reed, it might be a little bit more focused than one that is a little bit more flexible. Reflections of your sound waves in the tube reinforce the vibrations at the of the reed at the frequencies of the tube resonance. So there's your feedback mechanism. So not unlike what's going on with those standing waves getting set up in the tube and then picking out a particular frequency. The same thing is going on here. But, you know, if the frequency isn't there to begin with, then that note can't be played. The reed does act as a closed end. So instead of having N times S over 2L with 1, 2, and so on, you get N times S over 4L because the fundamental has a wavelength of 4L instead of 2L, and then only odd harmonics are expressed. Again, this is for a cylindrical instrument, something like a clarinet, and a lot of organ pipes that use this, but not for something like a saxophone or an oboe, which is a conical bore. So some pipe organs will have a tunable reed. They have a tuning wire, which allows you to basically reposition where the reed is pressed on. Oops, didn't mean to hit that. So if you push this down, now this is, say, pressing here, that's not going to allow this to move quite as much. It's going to make it an effectively more stiff reed, and it's going to change the resonance of the tube. This can allow you to fine tune the tone coming out of the pipe if your conditions change somewhat. So if the temperature changes and you need to make minor adjustments, this is a way you can do this. So those are our inputs, edge tones versus reeds. Now we'll get into bore shapes and sizes. Size is the easy thing. The diameter of the bore is basically going to determine how loud the instrument is. So a larger bore instrument is going to create louder sounds, which is why something like a saxophone is really loud comparative to a clarinet, because, well, when you think about a traditional tenor sax anyway, a tenor sax has a larger diameter, and so it's moving more air, and thus it's going to be louder. If the bores are of equal length, then they will have the same resonant frequencies. And we'll see this on the next couple of slides. What they mean here is if you are looking at a closed pipe that is cylindrical versus conical bore, and they're the same length, they're going to have the same fundamental note. The harmonics will be different. And one way you can look at this is comparing something like a clarinet to one of the smaller saxophones, like Kinney G alto or soprano sax. Those are more akin to a clarinet in length. And the big difference there is the fact that the saxophones are still conical bore, and so they tend to be brighter instruments because they have more harmonics in them. The positions of the nodes and antinodes are where we want to position our finger holes. We place our finger holes essentially so that we get our antinodes positioned exactly where we need to, so that the notes that you want to play get expressed. So if you want to play a C, and you know for a C with this length of tube, you need to have the antinode at a particular spot, you put your finger hole there so that that antinode can be fixed there whenever that finger hole is open. And the flares at the ends of the tubes are not associated with the bore. The bell end is what that is called. That's where it flares really rapidly at the far end of the instrument. These have use in changing the effective length of the tube, because when we are talking about the length of the tube, a flute is actually effectively a little bit longer than the actual length of the tube from the mouth hole to the far end opening. And different frequencies see effectively different length tubes. And so what you do is you have that flare, that bell end flare on like a clarinet and a saxophone. That's to make it so that all those notes effectively play with very similar lengths, because the lower notes will follow the flared bell further than the higher frequency notes, and so you can actually tune, give a little bit of extra tuning to the instrument from the shape of that bell. It becomes way more important for brass instruments, and we'll focus a lot more on the bell end for brass instruments for getting their characteristic sound than we care about with the woodwinds. But the main point of interest with the bell end is that it's to kind of keep it so that all the notes you're trying to play can be resonated kind of equally well. So for a conical bore instrument where we have a closed end, it would never come to a true point like this, of course, but close enough for describing what's going on. So what's going on in a cylinder, I'm going to pull up the tool here. So if we had a cylinder, could draw a straight line, but I'm just going to draw something like this. Our standing wave, if we're looking at the waves that travel down the tube, they're going to be plane waves. So plane waves are going to travel down the tube, bounce back and forth. And these plane waves are going to have a very well-defined fixed frequency and wavelength. So only standing waves that match the conditions for our cylinder are going to be allowed at any given time. If we were to change this to a closed tube, this behavior is still the same. But what changes when we have a conical bore is, since these walls are no longer parallel, this plane wave doesn't stay intact like this. It's actually going to curve and fill in the space as it travels down. So you'll have this curvature to the wave instead of nice plane waves. And what this curvature does is it actually allows those even harmonics that are not allowed when we have a closed tube. So if I close this off down here, we only have the 1, 3, 5 harmonics that are allowed. But by changing this wave shape from a plane wave to kind of a section of a sphere, this allows the second harmonic to show up. So here's our fundamental. We have an antinode here. It doesn't actually max out at the far end. You'll notice it gets bigger and then it comes down. This is because this has to fall off as 1 over r squared effectively as we move further and further from this. So our true antinode happens before the far end of the instrument when we're looking at displacement. But if we look at pressure, we do have our antinode at the far end and a node at the open end. Again, this is a similar idea. We end up with a bigger node here, or a bigger antinode here, and a smaller one here, and it kind of tapers some. And so what the cylindrical this conical bore allows is this wave spreading out as it moves down here opens up these harmonics that are not otherwise available when we have parallel walls. And this is why a saxophone sounds so much brighter than a clarinet. A clarinet, the walls are effectively parallel almost all the way down, except for the very far bell end. And so you have that characteristic kind of square wave, only 1, 3, 5 harmonic type thing going on for the bass tone of the clarinet. With the saxophone, you kill that because the conical bore allows the second harmonic to be expressed, and the third and the fourth and the fifth. So instead of just having odd harmonics, once we change our bore to conical, we open up all harmonics. Now, how can we tune our tubes? There are several ways. If one way is actually changing the length of the tube. And so on this end, you have a plunger that you could change the length. And when you would need to tune it effectively is if the temperature changes. Since the speed of sound is highly dependent on the temperature, you will need to change the length of the tube in one way or another to keep the same pitch as the temperature changes. So you can have a plug that's movable. Here you have a cap that allows you to extend in or out at the far end. Both of these are changing the length of the tube and thus changing the pitch to match whatever the speed of sound is. You can also open the pipe up. This is commonly done with organ pipes where you have the far end of the pipe. You can kind of peel back and put back into place to change the effective length of the tube. This effectively allows it to be a little bit shorter when you peel this back. There's also shaping the bell. So the bell end is going to allow longer, lower frequency notes. They'll diffract more easily. And so they'll follow this and they'll see an effectively longer tube, and higher frequency notes will see a shorter pipe and reflect back sooner. Again, more important for brass instruments to get their particular tone, but this can tune what's going on with a bell, the bell end of a woodwind. And here at this end, this is kind of the converse. The low frequency notes will follow this further. And I'm not exactly sure what that shape allows. It may be in the textbook, because I think that's where this figure comes from. Which again, I don't have the textbook because it's at my desk in Plano. So finger holes. This is a fairly big chunk of the chapter, and I'm not much more well versed than what is on here. I don't think there are that many questions on finger holes in general, but I will talk about what I do understand and know. What a finger hole does is allows air to flow out in and out of the tube at a certain position. So if you have a single length tube with no finger holes, you can play the fundamental and the harmonics of the fundamental, and that's it. It can possibly give you a whole chromatic scale if you're good enough at pulling all those higher harmonics out of the tube, but it's not an effective way to build a chromatic scale because you're building over a really large range. And if you want to play just like a regular old major scale, you would want to keep all the notes within an octave. So to do that, rather than just play harmonics, we actually put holes in the tube so that we can allow air to flow out there and fix an antinode, displacement antinode at that position, or a pressure node, same thing. And what this does is it allows you to play a note with a slightly different frequency. It effectively shortens the tube by a small amount, and by shortening the tube, you get a little bit higher frequency. So anytime you're playing a woodwind, the lowest note you can play is with all the finger holes closed. Opening finger holes will always shorten the tube, and shortening the tube means higher frequencies. So the position of the first open hole fixes the first displacement antinode of your fundamental. And so it's effectively shortening the tube, gives you a shorter wavelength, and then gives you a higher pitch. So here we have a simple tube where we cut a single hole in. And by putting a hole here, instead of playing this fundamental where the wavelength is 4L, we're playing this next harmonic. I guess it's supposed to be the harmonic anyway, where the frequency is 3 times this frequency. Now we'll actually position more than one hole, and we're not always putting it right at the harmonic either. We're trying to build in our regular old scale so we can play, major, minor scales, whatever you need to play. So this one is showing kind of a simplistic construction for a recorder. We have a recorder with a total length of L, Here's your mouthpiece where you blow in. Here's the knife edge. Here's the inner bore of the instrument. And they've set it up so that this hole here is exactly an octave from the fundamental that you would get if all of these were closed. And so what this then allows you to do is, by knowing what pitch you need, you can fix all the positions of the different notes on your chromatic scale. So here's your C. The first half step would be your C sharp, then D, D sharp, E, and so on and so on. So if you wanted to build a simple instrument that allowed you to play up to an octave, you would put all these in. There would be 12 finger holes, which would be, of course, quite a bit of a problem for a human, or I think 11 finger holes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 12, because that would be the 12th. 12 semitones in an octave. So you'd have to have one hole for each pitch. Closing each of these would lower the pitch progressively until you get to the far end. The spacing would determine the exact pitch you get. So you would want it such that the length to the D flat would give you a wavelength that's just short enough so that the frequency goes up by a half step, and then another half step and another half step, and so on. You'll notice that they appear to get closer together as you move further from the end. The spacing is a little bit smaller and smaller. They also change the size of the finger holes because the lower note really needs a bigger opening to fix that antinode stronger and actually give you the resonance that you need. So the higher frequency notes don't require as big of a finger hole as the lower frequency notes. Size of the holes does affect the pitch. Larger holes enable more air to move through, which will reinforce that antinode more strongly. If you have a bigger hole, the antinode is going to be much closer to the hole instead of maybe a little bit off. And again, with a low frequency note, you need that bigger hole to actually be able to move enough air to create the note. You can change the size of the hole by closing it partially. And what they did on on recorders is the last holes are typically two smaller adjacent holes that you can close one or the other, and it gives you a little bit more pitch flexibility. It also will allow you to play it with the actual number of fingers that you have, because you really only have 8 available fingers if you don't have a keying system on the instrument. 9 if you include their thumb registers near the mouthpiece. So a lot of times you have maybe 9 available fingers to play, possibly 10 with keying. But what that will allow you to do is play all 12 of those semitones. Whereas if you have an instrument like this one, there's no way that you can physically close all of these holes at the same time. You can only close 10 of them if you were to have the recorder fixed on something so you could use your thumbs. But realistically, you could only use 8 at any given time, so you couldn't close all of the finger holes. And this is also partly why there are keys on a lot of woodwinds, is so that you can increase the range of the instrument by using a keying system, so that mechanisms are actually opening and closing the holes rather than trying to do it all with your fingers, which will limit the number of tones that you can play. So deep holes, if you have a tube with a really thick wall, so that would be maybe a thick tube. Maybe I'll draw this. So if your tube walls are such that they are really thick, this is the bore down here, and you're cutting these finger holes in here. If these finger holes have a significant amount of volume, they can actually cause feedback into the bore, which will break up your standing waves and make the instrument less effective. And so, what you typically do, especially on instruments that do have thicker walls, is you chamfer the edges of these finger holes on the inside. You curve them off um, so that the air can move in and out more steadily, rather than getting these big kind of chunks that can mess up your standing waves that are in the bore themselves. So you kind of round these off rather than have just straight drill holes into the instrument itself, because the right angles help play a factor in that being a really strong resonance. You make just like a mini tube here, which will really break up the higher frequencies. Close it up. Clearly, the shape of the bore is going to matter on where you place the holes. On something like a recorder, you can place them all in a straight line fairly easily because it is a cylindrical bore instrument. Um, and the holes are fairly small. But once you start getting to a conical bore and very large holes, you kind of have to make uh, a judgment on where exactly you're going to put all these different finger holes in. And so what you can do is you can move them around on the board and make them more comfortable. Or in the case of adding a keying system, you can place them pretty much wherever you want, so long as the keying system can move the finger hole opening and closing uh, and put the keys in a position that's really effective for the player to be able to use. And so once you bring keying into play, you have a lot more of the instrument to play with in terms of placing your finger holes, so you can put them in positions that allows you to get a better tuning stability to the notes. Um, and the bore shape will also allow you to changing the bore shape will make some notes more stable in general. Fork fingering, which I think is a flute and recorder thing. Um, again, not being someone who played this, but when you fork finger, you can have a higher frequency standing wave in the open hole region. Um, and so what you can actually have, what you can do is close distant holes and actually give you pitches that are higher than what you would see normally if all those holes were open past the first open hole on your instrument. I think this is fairly common in recorders. It's how you get some of the pitches, since you only have a certain number of finger holes on a real recorder to actually be able to play the notes. So within the woodwind family, we have recorders and flutes are edge tone instruments. And when we say flutes, we mean the whole flute family, all the different, piccolo flutes and all that. Clarinets and saxophones are our single reeds. Oboes and bassoons are double reeds, again, English horn, but we're not going to spend that much time on that. And then pipe organs use all three driving mechanisms. Edge tone and single reed are the most common, but you do have all three at different times. So a recorder, you have 7 finger holes and a thumb hole. The bore can be cylindrical or conical. Most of the time, I think modern recorders are more conical or more cylindrical, but don't quote me on that. You do have an open tube for a recorder with 7 finger holes. Opening the last hole effectively shortens the instrument. If the hole is smaller than the bore, the effective length is a little longer than the distance to the last finger hole. So smaller holes at the end gives you a little bit more play, so you can position that last double hole in a more convenient position while still giving you the pitch that you want. When you overblow in a recorder, you favor the second or third harmonic over the fundamental. What effectively happens is the fundamental might be down here in your noise spectrum. So let's say the turbulence in your noise spectrum gives you something, a fairly broad kind of guy like this or something like this for the fundamental. And our fundamental is, say, maybe here. If you blow harder, the turbulence pitches the noise up. You still get this really broad resonance, but it might be here instead of there. And now there's just not that much available input at the fundamental. And if this is where the second harmonic is, then now I'm going to prefer that over the fundamental. And if this is my third, that might be equally preferred. And this is why when you blow really, really hard into a recorder, it gets really squeaky because you're hitting those really high harmonics of that open tube. You've shifted that noise spectrum way, way up. And this is why recorders tend to squeak. You can open the thumb hole at the back end, which is near the mouthpiece, and create a displacement antinode there and actually cause that to be a little bit more prominent. The downside to overblowing like that is blowing harder will necessarily also make it loud and not allow you to really have that much dynamic range. And so recorders don't really have a way for you to hit those harmonics easily without just playing loud. And that's because the shape of the instrument, sending the air over the knife edge, basically you blow into a mouthpiece and it directs the air for you. The only way to hit those harmonics is to actually just blow harder. When we move to a flute, overblowing is a little bit, you have a lot more control versus a recorder. I will note that the sound you get out of a recorder or a flute tends to be very close to a sine wave. It's not dead on, but it's a lot closer than a lot of the other woodwind family instruments that we'll talk about later on. Click back in here. So the modern flute, you have your embouchure hole, your mouth hole, and you blow over the edge of the mouth hole to generate your edge tone. The benefit here is you're controlling the airflow. So instead of this kind of windway directing the airflow over the knife edge like you see in a recorder, here you actually determine how much air is hitting this. And so you have a lot more control over the volume range. In addition, if you watch the video on playing harmonics, you also have the ability to maintain that volume range and play those higher harmonics by basically activating the different formants in your speech. So by changing the shape of your mouth, we remember from talking about voices, if you go from O to E, those are two different formant regions that are generated by the change in shape of your mouth. If you do the same thing with a flute, you effectively will change the formants, the frequencies that are available to drive your vibrations in the tube. And so you can easily play those higher harmonics and still control the volume, which is something you can't really do for a recorder. The modern flute has a metallic construction. Typically, you're going to see in concert flutes things like silver and possibly even gold. It, as I mentioned, the body material doesn't play that much impact. It's just typically when you are going to make something out of a more expensive material, you're going to pay more attention to detail. And so that's probably why those come out sounding better to most people. Also, if you spend $2,000 on something, you're going to think it sounds good, even if it maybe doesn't sound exactly the way you think it does. Psychology matters. The modern flute is also cylindrical bore. There are mechanical keys added to close a tone hole. So instead of having a bunch of finger holes, you have mechanical keys that are played with the fingers that can open and close finger holes. So that will give you more notes than a recorder where you only have those 7 finger holes in the thumb hole. And you also have the ability to tune the flute by changing the length. So the far end of the flute here can be moved in or out so that you can shorten or lengthen your flute. The clarinet is kind of the odd duck out of all of these. It's the only major woodwind that behaves acoustically like a closed tube. When we talk about the other reed instruments, oboes and bassoons and saxophones, they are like closed tubes, but those are conical bore closed tubes, which allows the even harmonics to be expressed. For the clarinet, because it is a cylindrical bore until the very far end of the instrument, it behaves like a closed tube, where the reed end is your closed end, and of course the far end is the open end. And so since we have a cylindrical bore closed tube, those first few even harmonics are basically missing from the clarinet spectrum. The second and fourth, the second is almost completely gone. The fourth is diminished substantially. And the sixth and above, the sixth starts to come in, but above you actually end up picking up the eighth and the 10th. Those start to come in. And that has to do with the bell end of the instrument giving slightly different effective lengths, largely. The clarinet overblows at the third harmonic. So when you blow in to a clarinet harder, you go from the fundamental to the third harmonic, which is an octave plus a fifth, if I remember right. Yeah, an octave plus a fifth, instead of a flute or a recorder where you activate the second harmonic. Also, the clarinet has a lower frequency than the other instruments of the same length. So if you're comparing to an oboe or a flute, which are all in the same range of length, the clarinet is roughly an octave lower than the flute or the oboe because the closed tube has a longer wavelength, which is double the open tube. And that means you're roughly an octave down from a flute, which is about the same tube length. Oboes are also in the same ballpark and also about an octave up from the clarinet. Saxophones are single reed instruments, and these, even though they maintain some similarities to a saxophone and clarinet mouthpieces are similar but not identical. Saxophones are often larger bore than the clarinet, and most people think of like a tenor sax when they think of a saxophone. There are alto and soprano saxes, which are more akin to the look of a clarinet. Clarinets are often made of wood. Saxophones are almost exclusively made of metal. And the metal is not really what changes the tone. It's the fact that you go from a cylindrical bore to a conical bore. But something like an alto or a soprano sax doesn't look at first glance all that different from a clarinet, except for the fact that it's metal. But the fact that the saxophone has a conical bore instead of a cylindrical bore means they have very different tones, even if you're trying to play the same note on each of them. The larger bore of something like a tenor sax also means it's going to be a lot louder than a clarinet, which is oftentimes way too loud. Saxophones are often incredibly brash and loud just because they move a lot of air. Because of the larger bore, they use very large tone holes, especially at the far end of the instrument, and it's played with keys. Also, the clarinet is a keyed instrument. Again, this just allows you to extend the playable range of the instrument so that you can use a mechanism rather than try to close things with your finger. You couldn't close saxophone holes with your fingers because they get really, really large near the bell end of the instrument. The conical bore means that all harmonics are present and it overblows at an octave instead of an octave plus a fifth like the clarinet does. Small changes in your mouth position can greatly affect the pitch, and that is sensitivity due to the conical bore again, because you have so many more harmonics available compared to the closed nature of the cylindrical bore of the clarinet. Just small changes can give you a big change in pitch. So this shows kind of the cross section of a clarinet on top and a saxophone on bottom. So you have two thumb holes, a register hole and a thumb hole for the clarinet, a hole up here, and then your normal fingering sequence. The length is about 66 centimeters, it looks like. And then this is a saxophone where you have a couple of holes, one for octave hole H1, one for octave hole H2, and then your last hole of the instrument. And then this is a much longer instrument. As you can see, the whole thing's about 108 centimeters. And typically when you get into the bigger saxes, rather than just keep it straight like you do for a clarinet, you bend this up just to deal with comfort playing, because getting some of this mechanism wise is easier once you bend that around. Double reeds are acoustically similar to single reeds. The tone quality is distinguished more by the bore than the actual reeds themselves. But again, every little piece matters, so different reeds are going to sound a little bit different. Oboes are conical bore, but the bore is much narrower than the sax, and so the pitch ends up being very susceptible to changes in the embouchure, or the mouth position again. The conical bore nature of the oboe also lends the same kind of harmonic content that you get, the richness that you get in a saxophone, but is missing in a clarinet. And bassoon is another conical bore instrument. It has an extremely large length to bore diameter ratio. It means it's really long and fairly narrow. It is conical, but it's a very kind of gently slanting cone because of the length of the instrument. The bore is about 8 feet long, and it's bent to be able to be playable, because no one except the tallest person in the world would be able to play an 8-foot long instrument, and even they would have to like stand on a stool to make it work. So instead they bend it up and around so that you can take this 8 feet and make it more like a 3 to 4 foot instrument. The nature of the length to bore diameter ratio means you get even more pitch susceptibility to embouchure for a bassoon, and some notes can be moved up and down by as much as a major third. the interesting characteristic of a bassoon is it is very formant driven in the way it plays. There's definitely certain regions that get enhanced, and so there are different harmonic regions in the overtones that get enhanced more than others. So the last thing we have are pipe organs, where we're dealing with flue pipes, which are your edge tone pipes, where we send our air up from the bottom, we direct it over a knife edge, and that is going to generate our noise spectrum to create the resonance in the tube. These tubes can be either open or closed at the far end, and the closed pipes will allow you to play lower notes with a richer, or not a richer, a kind of a darker timbre than an open pipe. But if you need to play a really, really low note and you only have so much space, closing the pipes off gives you that longer wavelength and lower frequency. And so that tends to be done in pipe organs. You have certain banks of notes that may be closed off so that you get those deeper notes. There are also reed pipes where a single reed will generate the tone and stronger amplitudes at the higher harmonics are created. And I've got a couple of, the next couple of slides show some Fourier analysis of the same note being played by a flue pipe and a reed pipe. But also I have included a couple of videos of toccata and fugue being played on a flue organ and a reed organ, so you can hear the difference in the timbre of the two. The reed pipe organs tend to be a lot brighter than the flue pipe organs. And toccata and fugue, if you're not familiar, it's the Phantom of the Opera piece that he plays on the pipe organ. So yeah, you can take a listen to those and see how they sound differently to you. So here's our flue pipe organ. We have a fundamental just short of A, right at about 880 hertz. So this is up an octave from concert A. First harmonic here, the second harmonic, I mean the first overtone, it's almost 1760, and here's the third and the fourth. You'll notice this is a more of a logarithmic scale, so this is not going to maintain linear. But so this would be second harmonic, this would be the fourth. And so you can see these first seven-ish are present. The higher ones may be there, but they're harder to pick out of just kind of the general noise we have here. But these low frequency ones are very prominent. When we go to a reed organ, now here's that 880, a little bit more mistuned than the other one was. Here's the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. You can see all these harmonics all the way up, basically to the edge of hearing. And so tonally, this is going to be a lot brighter than what you hear out of the flue pipe. Flue pipe is going to be darker, kind of richer sounding in terms of being more focused in a certain frequency region, while this is going to be kind of bright and brassy. The big benefit to a reed organ is that change in tone, and it's easier to build a reed organ that is more compact than it is a flue organ, because if you need to play really low notes for a flue pipe, you're going to necessarily need really long pipes, and that just kind of limits what you can play to a certain degree. And so that is it. That is our woodwind chapter. There's not all that many resources to go with it this time, but I provided a couple of videos so you can compare the organs, a couple of videos so you can see how a reed actually vibrates. One, so you can hear what overblowing does for creating harmonics in something like a recorder or a flute. And then just a few pages that it kind of expound a little bit more on some of the details of this. I would say that those pages really aren't necessary, but they might be useful if you're having trouble picturing some stuff. There are some decent animations and some pictures that may help. I would definitely remember that you only are really responsible for what's in the homework. So a lot of the stuff I said is kind of overly complicated, and the stuff on those pages would be overly complicated. A lot of times you just get asked something like, does the position of the finger hole affect the tone or something like that, which is an easy question to answer. So yeah, that's it. This went a little bit quicker than I thought, so I did it all in one run through. The next chapter again is brass instruments. It's really short. I think it's like 12 slides or something like that. So that one will be pretty quick. I do have a handful of neat videos for the brass chapter, whereas this one was kind of a little bit less stuff that I've been able to find doing this class in past. And then we'll move on to strings, which I have a little bit better understanding of, having been a viola player for about 10 years while I was in grade school, and dabble badly on guitar here and there. So I have a little bit better understanding of how those instruments work, having played them. And then pianos, which I didn't play, but there's a lot of resources, thankfully. So that is it, and I will probably have this up early in the week. And again, it's stuff after the test, which I will post an announcement about that soon. Officially, the test is supposed to be on Thursday, but I will probably open it on Wednesday and have it run a handful of days after that, just to give people a little bit more time to take it. And I'll provide more detail about that. It will be in Canvas. It still is 50 questions. Once the test is closed completely, and probably a few days after that, I will allow the answers to be seen. That's really about all I can say, I guess. The downside to us being closed is that I still have your first test, and I will hopefully be able to come up with a way to get you the first test so that you can have that to study for the final. But I'll have to see what I can come up with. So yeah, test will be this week, but chapters 9 and 10 are not covered on it, so you don't have to worry about that at this point unless you're just interested in getting ahead. So have a good day, and I will post this soon.